In today's lecture, we're going to be learning about how to create forms in React. In our previous lectures, we learned about how to create React applications, as well as how to manage state within those applications. However, with forms, state management can get pretty complex, so instead we're going to be learning about how to use the React Hook Form library, which is a library that will help make form state management a lot simpler. Finally, we'll learn how to validate our forms with the Zod Validation library, which will help ensure that any user inputted data is properly formatted and fits any constraints that we might like to add. Here is our finished form. We have a field for the user to input their name, password, we have confirm password field, a date, a checkbox, as well as a drop-down menu to select a pet. The name, password, and confirm fields are required, and we also have some other validation rules, such as a password strength checker, as well as ensuring that the date that the user inputs is not in the future. So if we'll leave the name field blank, our password can be password, we'll type password again, we'll pick a date in the future, we'll just leave that checked, and select bird. If we submit the form, we can see all of our error messages. The best way to learn is to just jump straight into coding, and let's start with the setup. So similar to the previous lecture, the first thing that we're going to do is create our React project. So we're just going to do bun create byte at latest, and we can just name our project React form. We can select React, and then TypeScript plus SWC. Now we can cd into our newly created React form folder, and we can run bun install. Now we can just open up our folder in VS Code. Awesome. So the default React project, again, comes with app.tsx and main.tsx files. So again, main.tsx is going to use our React component, which is all of this stuff. And we can just delete all of this. And we can just replace that with a div tag for now. And we can also get rid of this, as well as our unused imports. Great. Now we have a really nice blank slate. We just save that. And we can always run bun run dev. And if we go to the localhost that they give, then we can just see our current app, which is blank because we have nothing. So similarly to our previous project, the first step is to think about what components we might want to create. And this is going to be much simpler than our previous React project. For our form, we're just going to have one form component, which our app component is going to be using. So within source, let's create a new folder. I'm just going to call it components. Then within the components folder, we'll create a new file called form.tsx. And this is just going to contain our form component. So you can just do function form just gonna have that return a placeholder div for now. And at the bottom, we can export our form component. We'll just have to be a default export. Now within app.tsx, we can import our newly created form component. And we can use it right here. Now we're going to be introducing the form element. The form element is basically a container that is going to be enclosing all of our interactive form elements. Now we've actually already seen some form elements, namely the input element. So just a reminder of what that looks like. Here we have a bunch of input elements, all of different types. For example, we have a text input, which is just a text box where a user could input their name. Likewise, we have a password input, a date input, and a checkbox input. We also have labels for each of our input fields, which is connected to their respective input field through the ID and HTML for attributes. And if we save and then refresh the page, we can see all of our form elements. We can also have something like a drop-down menu in our form. So let's say we want a drop-down menu for the user to select a pet. Then we can use the select HTML element, which is going to surround a bunch of option elements. Each option element is going to have a value attribute, which is basically just the value associated with the option. So for example, if we wanted to have an option for dog, then we can pass that into the value, and we can also have some text saying dog that is within the option element. And you can see that down here. So if we wanted to add more options, say cat, and bird, then we can see that reflected in our drop-down menu. And the select field is for only selecting one option. We can pass in an optional attribute to the select element to make it multiple choice, but we're not going to cover that for now. And similarly to the other fields, we can give the select field a associated label. And we can just pass in an ID, and we'll just call that pet. Now the last thing to add to our form is a submission button. So we can just add that at the bottom. And it's just going to be a button of type equal to submit. And voila. Now right now, the submission button doesn't really do anything. And in fact, there's no way to really submit the form the way we have it right now. Now the way that React implements submission of a form and state management for a form without any external libraries is pretty ugly. Luckily, we have really nice libraries that will help us manage our form state. The external library that we're going to be using to handle our form state is React Hook Form. React Hook Form is a library for handling forms in React, and it really nicely simplifies things like validation, which we're going to cover later, handling form state, as well as incorporating other forms libraries. It also provides a bit of a performance boost with smarter or like less re-rendering of components. First, we're simply going to install React Hook Form. So we're just going to do bun install React-Hook-Form. Cool. Then we're going to just simply import a few things from React Hook Form. So we're going to do import useForm from React Hook Form. Now the core functionality of React Hook Form, in other words, handling the state of our form, is basically contained with the useForm custom hook that we just imported. A custom hook is basically just a hook which is not built in with React. Some built-in hooks that we've seen before in our React lectures, as a reminder, are useState and useEffect. To get started with using useForm, you can simply, at the top of our form component, do const register and handleSubmit, which will be returned when we call the useForm hook. This should seem roughly similar to how we used, for example, useState in our React lectures. Basically, when we call the useForm hook, it's going to return a few things. It's going to return a few return props, namely the register and handleSubmit return props. And don't worry about what exactly they do. We're going to cover that very soon. There's a few other return props that useForm can return. There's actually a bunch, and you can look them up in the React Hook Form documentation if you so want. For now, we're just going to focus on the register and handleSubmit props, and then later we're going to introduce a third return prop as well, but for now we're just going to focus on register and handleSubmit. Now we'd like our form to be strictly typed. What that means is we want to be explicitly defining ahead of time what we want any sort of inputted data into our form to look like. That includes what fields are present and what is the type of each of those fields. We can accomplish this pretty simply by defining a type, which is going to have a correspondence with what we have described here. So basically in that type, for example, we might have a property name that corresponds with this input, and that should obviously have a type string. Now we can pass in that type to useForm, so that useForm can pass it to register and handleSubmit, and they can all together sort of enforce the type and make sure that any inputted data is in fact cohering to the type as we have sort of expected it to be. So we can just go ahead and define it just to see what that looks like. We'll define a type and we'll just call it inputs. Now the properties of inputs are going to coincide with each of the fields that are in our form. So what that's going to look like is we might have a name property that coincides with this name input right here. So that's just going to be a string. We also have a password field, which is also a string. We're going to have a date, which is also a string. A checkbox, which is actually a Boolean. And we also have pet, which is a string. So basically the inputs type is describing the type and shape of the form data, which coincides with all of the fields that are within our form. Now we can pass that inputs type to useForm, which is going to inform how register and handleSubmit function, which we'll see in a bit. Let's first talk about handleSubmit. Now, form elements have a built-in attribute called onSubmit. This is expecting an event handler, which is basically when our form is submitted, what happens. Now, if you weren't using React Hook Form, you would have to implement this event handler on your own. But since we are using React Hook Form, we can simply use handleSubmit. So basically what happens is when your form is submitted, handleSubmit is going to first validate your data, which we're going to cover later. So basically validation is going to make sure that your form data is properly formatted. So for example, any required fields are actually filled out by the user. Once handleSubmit finds that your form data is in fact valid, it's going to call a function. Now handleSubmit actually expects its own argument, which is going to be that function that is going to be called when your form data is found valid. So we can just call this function onSubmit also. And we can just define it up here. Now, whatever function you pass in is going to take in data, which is just your form data. And we can just keep it simple and just console.log our form data. Now, if we hover over data, we'll see that parameter data explicitly has an any type, since we're using TypeScript. And if we hover over handleSubmit, we'll actually see that the first argument that it's expecting is a function of type submit handler, which takes in inputs. So what does that mean? Well, here inputs coincides with this type that we've already defined. And submit handler is a type that we actually have to import from React Hook Form. Then down here, we can simply assign onSubmit to be an event handler and the data that it takes in to be of type inputs. We now have it set up so that when our form is submitted, handleSubmit is going to check that our data is valid, which we're going to cover later. If it finds that our data is valid, it's going to call this custom onSubmit function that we passed in, which is in turn going to console.log our data. However, if we try to submit our form, and let's just type some stuff in here. And then if we inspect element to open up the console, and if we try to submit our form, you can see down here that nothing got logged. This is because we haven't yet registered any of our fields. To register a field means for us to add that field and connect it to React Hook Form's internal form state. Basically, when we register a field, React Hook Form is going to begin to track that field. And that means that for now, when we submit the form, the data will actually get logged to console. But later on, we can see that this will also allow us to do things like error handling and validation. So to register a field is pretty simple. Within whatever form field you have, just going to do this and then call register with, and if we hover over this, you can see that register is expecting a name that is associated with this input field. And any of the names that you pass into register need to be reflected in our inputs type. So if we tried something like names or like some typo, that wouldn't work. So just be careful of that. And let's close this bracket. And then we can just do this for all the other fields. With each field having their own respective names. And in our types, in our input type, we did name the checkbox field checkbox, so let's change that to okay. Again, it only really matters that whatever you pass into register has a match with a property in your inputs type. And finally, we'll just have select be registered. Cool. So now, when we submit our form, any of the data that we inputted or anything that we typed into these fields is actually going to be reflected as a change to our internal form state. So basically, React Form is actually going to keep track of what we've typed in here. And then that form data is actually going to be passed into our submit handler. And in that case, I should hopefully log what we have to console. So let's open up inspect element again, go to console. And if we submit, yeah. So all of the things that we inputted to our form get logged right here. And we can put something in date. Just pick a random date. Cool. This is just a side note, but you might note that right now our submit handler is simply console logging our data. But in real form applications, you'll probably be replacing the submit handler with a script that, for example, puts your data into some database. But we're not going to be covering that in this lecture. And for any assignments, the only thing that's going to happen to your form data is that it's just going to be console logged. So far, we've set up a form that uses React Hook Form to handle our form state. Now we're going to look into using React Hook Form to do a little bit of validation, as well as to display error messages. It's important to note that we're going to be using later on Zod as a validation library to implement validation. We're not going to be using React Hook Form implementation of validation. But even when we're using Zod, displaying error messages is still going to be the same. It's still going to be implemented the same. So we're just going to show a little bit of how to do validation with React Hook Form, just so we can also show you how to display error messages, which is going to remain the same even when we switch to Zod for validation later. Let's say we want to make the password field a required field so that the user has to type in some sort of password. The way that we add validation rules to our form with React Hook Form is by passing them into register. So to make, for example, the password field required, you can simply pass in a new object with required set to a custom error message. For example, password is required. Taking a step back to look at what we did, if we hover over register, we can see that we can optionally pass in an options, which is type register options. This is basically this object that we passed in. Options has a bunch of other properties that you can pass in. One of those, which we used here, is the required property, which can take in either a Boolean. So if we didn't have this custom error message, we could also do something like true. And what we did here is instead of saying it to that Boolean, we just straight up passed in a custom error message, password is required, which basically does the same thing of making this password field required. There's a load of other properties that we can pass in to register options, some of which also do some cool validation things. We're not going to cover those because, again, we're going to be covering validation with Zod instead. But if you're interested, you're more than free to look it up in the documentation. Now to actually display the error message that we've passed in here, we can actually use conditional rendering. So what that would look like is we can just display our error message like next to or below the password field. And remember that whenever you want to inject a little bit of TypeScript code within the TSX HTML that you have here, then you want to surround that with curly braces. So to conditionally render, we're first going to check if errors actually has an error for the password field. So we can just do that by doing errors dot password. So basically, if this exists, then we're going to do whatever comes after this and. So now what we want to do is actually display the error message. And we can do that by surrounding it with some paragraph elements or like whatever else, like span, anything else. And then within here, we're going to again do some curly braces because this time we're going to access errors dot password dot message. And this part is actually going to coincide with this message password field is required that we passed in earlier. So to recap, only if there is an error associated with password, in other words, the user actually did forget to type in a password, only then is this going to evaluate. And that's going to return a paragraph tag that contains our error message. So let's just test that out. If we have nothing here, and then we click submit. Oh, first let's save. Yeah. So then if we type in something here, we can see that the error message disappears. And then if we delete everything, then the error message password field is required pops back up again. Finally, we're going to be talking about how to validate our form data using the Zod Validation library. So Zod is a validation and schema declaration library that can be used with React Hook Form. In fact, it replaces parts of React Hook Form's validation. And unlike React Hook Form, which can also be used with JavaScript, Zod is entirely in TypeScript. For Zod, you have to define a schema that describes the shapes and constraints or validation rules of your data. And with Zod, validation is written entirely in the same place as where your schema lives. So this forms a nice centralized place, which is separate from where your form elements and all of that HTML is going to live. Finally, Zod has a few built-in validation functions that just make life much easier. So the first thing that we're going to do is install any necessary dependencies. So first we're just going to install Zod. And we're also going to install @hookform/resolvers. So the second installation was for resolvers, which are basically things that React Hook Form will use to actually be able to integrate and use any external validation libraries. And we'll see how that works in a sec. Now that we've installed everything, we can import Z from Zod, as well as Zod resolver from @react_form/resolvers/Zod. Now, as we mentioned before, with Zod, you have to specify a schema. Basically, the schema is going to kind of be the catch-all location for any validation, as well as like where we're going to kind of declare the shape of our data. So to do that, we can just do const schema equals z.object. Now within this z.object, we're just going to list out sort of in the same format as we did when we declared our input type. We're just going to do name, and this time we're going to do string, z.string. Basically, what z.string is it's sort of already a validation method. It's basically saying, okay, name has to be a string, or it has to be of type string. And we can do the same for all the following form fields. Password is also a string. And date is also a string. Okay is a z.boolean. And head is a string. Now that we have the schema, we can actually replace the type inputs that we've defined down here to instead infer off of our schema. So what that's going to look like is just going to call z.infer with type of schema. Finally, we're also going to pass in our schema into Zod resolver, which we are in turn going to be passing into useForm. So what that's going to look like is going to set this resolver property to Zod resolver, and in turn we are going to pass in our schema to Zod resolver. So basically what's going on here is we're basically telling React Hook Form, hey, you should be using Zod to validate any data. And then React Hook Form is in turn going to be using Zod resolver to actually do that. Now, if you hover over types inputs, you'll see that it looks exactly the same as what we had before we defined our schema. However, Zod also comes with a lot of really nice ways to define even more specific types. For example, right now we have dates defined as a string, but what we can actually do is define it as a date object. It's important to note that with raw HTML, with this date picker, it's actually going to first be inputted as a string. But if we want to, let's say further on, refine or add some validation rule to date, where we need it to be treated as a date object, and we'll see what that means later, then we can't have it defined as a string within our schema. And a nicer way to define date would actually be to first coerce it and then apply the date validation method, which basically is saying this field is in fact a date object field. Similarly, something really nice we can do for the pet field, which recall is a select field, is we can do a z.enum, and then we can simply pass in the values of each option, which are dog, cat, and bird. And then it's important to note that if you have an option that has a blank value, so, or like an empty string value, so something like this, then you would have to include the empty string as part of your enum. To mark fields as being required, it's important to note that in Zod, fields are by default required. So for any fields that aren't required, you actually have to say explicitly that they are optional. So for example, if we want the name, password, and this OK checkmark to be required fields, then we can just leave them be for now. Or there's other stuff we have to do, but for now we can just leave them alone. Then for date and pet, we can apply the optional validation method. Now it's important to note that even though name and password are required fields by default, we can still actually submit name and password without anything inputted. This is because React will automatically put in a default value of the empty string, and this will pass the required validation check that Zod will do. So instead, for these string fields, what we need to do is call the min validation method, which is basically saying, okay, the string that you input needs to have this minimum length of characters. So if we just want to say that the field is required, then we just pass in a min length of 1. Min length, or min, also accepts a error message. So we could do something like name is required. And then we can do the same thing for password. We'll just say min length of 1 and password is required. Now, if we try submitting the form, you can see that the password field is required message pops up. And we need to also do some conditional rendering for displaying the error message associated with the name field real quickly. There we go. And then for this checkbox field, we can just leave it be. It'll be required, but again, the user can always just leave it unchecked. Now let's get to the meat of validation with Zod. It's important to note that all of this stuff can be implemented with React Hook form, but it's just a bit nicer with Zod. So let's say we want to add a more complicated validation rule to the date field. Let's say we want to be able to check if the date that the user inputs is a date that's not in the future. If it is a future date, then we want to say that that date is invalid. So to do that, we can do .refine. This is a validation method where you can pass in a custom validation function. So we can just set up our function here. And the function you pass in has to return a Boolean. True if the date or whatever field you have is valid, and false if it's not valid. So this function should take in the date that the user inputs, which we've set up here to be a date object. Then within our function body, we basically want to be able to return if the date is before or less than today. So we can do that by doing const today equals a new date, which we can convert to an ISO string. And then we can just return if the date converted to an ISO string is less than today. Oh. And we should move this optional validation method call to be after our refine. There we go. So then if we do our whole conditional rendering to display the error message for the date field down here, and then we attempt to input a date that's in the future, let's say the 30th, then yeah, we get our error message, date cannot be in the future. So that's how you would do a custom validation function for a single field using Zod's refine validation method. One last thing. It's important to note that we did say that date was an optional field. So let's try submitting the form with no date. We'll just put like name. And let's try submitting. We see that we get back something unexpected, which says invalid date. So what's going on? Well, like we said before, if we don't submit anything, or if we leave this field blank, React is kind of going to substitute in the empty string. Then, when we do z.coerce to a date, that part is going to error because we're attempting to coerce an empty string into a date, which is an invalid date. So that's why we get that error message. Now, how can we fix this? Well, we can introduce the Zod or method, which is basic, and then we can do Zod dot literal z dot literal and then pass in the empty string. So what is this doing? Well, it's basically saying, okay, You can either have this validation or you can optionally have this validation. So this here is covering the case where we're passing in something as a date. So then we need to run our date validation method that we have defined here with refine, as well as we need to coerce that date into a date object. Alternatively, of course, the user can leave something blank. And like we said, that's going to get converted by React to just the empty string. So we're basically saying here, okay, in that case, the date could also or be a literal empty string, which is covered here by the Zod literal validation method. So hopefully that made sense. And we can see here if that fixes things. We can refresh the page, name, something here, and we'll just leave the date blank and submit. Okay, and nothing happens, which is what we wanted. So basically we've gotten rid of the invalid date error message. And just to make sure that our whole prevent the date from being in the future is still working, let's just do something like this, and voila. So we haven't broken anything, which is great. Now to show you how you can do a custom validation function that involves multiple fields rather than just one, as we did with date over here. We're going to create a new field just for demonstration purposes called confirm password. And this is just going to be a string. Let's build the associated HTML for that field. Just call it confirm password. Still going to be a type password, and we'll change the ID to confirm password. Also change the name that we're registering it with. As well as here. And we'll just preemptively change the error message displaying down here. Nice. So that shows up in our form. I've just moved the confirm password field up here instead. Now let's actually get into implementing our desired behavior. Again, we want it so that the user types in the same password into the confirm password field as they did into the password field. We're also going to be using refine, only this time, unlike date, where we were only really considering one field, here we're considering two fields, confirm password and password. So we're actually going to call refine after this object, sort of outside. So we're just going to refine. And like before, refine is going to take in our custom validation function. In this case, we're just going to compare if the password is the same as confirm password. However, for our custom validation function, this time we're going to be taking in the entire form data. But very similarly, we're just going to return true or false data confirm password equals data.password. Likewise, we can return a custom error message. This will, however, be passed in an object and do message confirm password must match password. And now we actually need to pass in, okay, what field is this error message going to be associated with? And we can do that by passing in path with confirm password. So now our custom error message is going to be displayed underneath the confirm password field, since we've already set up our conditional rendering here to display the error message. So let's just test that out. We can just do password is password, and then we'll just type we'll just type P, okay. And then let's just pick a random date, and then, okay, we'll just submit the form. And yeah, there is our custom error message, confirm password must match password. Finally, we've already kind of seen this before, but we can chain a bunch of Zod validation methods together. And this can create some really nice, powerful validation criteria. So for example, if we want to add a password strength criteria, so that like the password has to contain an uppercase letter and also has to contain a number, then we can use regex. And any regex pattern that you pass in is going to be surrounded by forward slashes. And then you can just do standard regex. So if we want to make sure that there is at least one uppercase letter, you can very simply just pass in a regex pattern that basically will match or return a match if this pattern is found, which is basically just a capital letter. And likewise, with all the other validation methods, we can pass in a custom error message. So password must contain at least one uppercase letter. Oh, and you can also do something a bit more nicely organized, which is you can just have all these validation methods on separate lines. So then we can do the same or something very similar to make sure that the user inputted password has at least one number. So this is just the regex pattern that will match if there is a number in the string that the user passes in as a password. You can also do a custom error message. Password must contain at least one digit. Now we can save our file. And if we reload, and then type something into password like ABC, and we'll do the same for confirm password, and then we try to submit, we can see that we get back the error message, password must contain at least one uppercase letter. So the error messages will display in the order that you sort of apply the Zod validation methods, and it will only display them one at a time. So it'll look something like this. And then if we add an uppercase A, then you can see that the message switches. And finally, we can just type in like 7, and their message disappears. And yeah, so that's basically it. We now have a functioning React form, which uses React hook form to manage submission and form state. And we're also incorporating Zod to handle things like form data validation, having things like password strength criteria, required fields, and cool things like making sure that the date is not in the future. So that about wraps it up for this lecture. As a recap, we learned how to create basic React forms. Then we learned how to use the React hook form library to manage our form state. Finally, we used the Zod Validation library in order to add validation rules to our form. So that about wraps it up for React as well. In our upcoming lectures, we're going to be diving into databases. I'll see you then.